Good evening, everyone. Just one housekeeping note, and we're going to move on to our keynote speaker. The housekeeping note is that they are going to keep the bar open. So feel free to get yourself a drink if you need one. Your talk is going to be tremendous, Judy. At any rate, I have the honor and distinction of introducing our keynote speaker this evening, Judith Wellman. And let me say a little bit about her, and then we'll get into her talk. Judith Wellman is Principal Investigator, Historical, New York Research Associates, Professor Emeritus, History Department, SUNY Oswego. She specializes in research and writing about historic sites in New York State relating to the Underground Railroad, abolitionism, African-American life, and women's rights. She lives in an old house on a mill pond in Granby, New York, surrounded by large maple trees, unruly gardens, wild creatures, and good neighbors. Recently, she had completed major studies of the Underground Railroad in Niagara Falls, a cultural resource survey of historic sites relating to women's suffrage in central New York, and a cultural resource survey of the Underground Railroad sites in Oneida County, New York. She won awards for her Underground Railroad work from the National Parks Services Network to Freedom, the American Association of State and Local History, New York State Historical Preservation Office, and many local and statewide groups. She is Vice President of the National Collaborative of Women's History Sites, Chair of the National Votes for Women's Trail Scholarly Advisory Committee, member of the Scholarly Advisory Board of the Glider Lehrman Institute, Secretary of the Women's Rights Alliance of New York State, and President of the 1816 Farmington Quaker Meeting House Museum. And on that note, I'm very proud to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Judith Wellman. Thank you.
Mark, thank you for that nice introduction. I'm exhausted just listening to all the stuff this person does. I don't know how she does it. I have a warning for you. There are pictures in this slideshow of lots of you in this room. So I know it's after dinner. You just had dessert. The bar is open. But if you fall asleep, you'll miss these. So this is going to be quick. It's going to be hopefully over the whole state. It's going to be frustrating maybe for you as it was for me, because I had to pick and choose so many of these historic sites relating to women's suffrage when the story involves millions of people and hundreds of historic sites. So with that housekeeping background out of the way, this is about the village of Seneca Falls, which you and I know and love, but it's also about much more, which is the whole tsunami wave that emerged from Seneca Falls for the women's rights movement in New York State. And it doesn't want to go. Okay. There are two main themes to this talk. One is, whoops, now it's taken over. One is the power of historic sites to tell this story about the breadth and diversity and immensity of women's suffrage across New York State over time. And the other one is the amazing power of persistent grassroots action, past and present, to make a difference in this world. This is dedicated, as I was doing this, I thought, you know, my great-great-aunt Martha, I found a suffrage speech in her papers. I'm going to dedicate this to Aunt Martha because she doesn't get enough recognition, and neither do all the Aunt Marthas and Uncle Silas's of the world, past and present, so known and unknown, who never, ever give up. And it's also dedicated to all of you, because I think you as local historians understand the power of grassroots action to change the world. You do it every day. Your work is absolutely incredible in terms of making us understand why we live where we live and how it affects where we're going. Sorry, this seems to be taking over. That's a ghost of change. Most of you know about the country's first women's rights convention at Seneca Falls in 1848. And that convention really introduced ideas and points that set the tone for women's rights through the history and even up for us today. We still deal with these issues. One of the most important things was the Declaration of Sentiments at Seneca Falls. It was patterned after the Declaration of Independence, except instead of saying we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, it said all men and women are created equal. And we continue now in our own lives to work on every demand. If you read the Declaration of Sentiments, you will see that we're still dealing with issues of education, jobs, the law, work, family, personal respect, sexual harassment. I don't know if there's any way I can make this keep going like this. Do you, Matt? Or do I just have to keep turning it back when I talk longer than keep talking? Okay, I'll keep talking. And okay, he's working on it. Today, we talk a lot about diversity and equity, and the equity of Seneca Falls is pretty obvious. The diversity of people at Seneca Falls may be less obvious to us because most of them were white people. And there were 300 people who packed that church, at least in the evening sessions. And they came from all walks of life. And I think as I was looking at this, we forget, at least I do, I have to remind myself, in the 19th century, Irish people didn't talk to British people or English people, and Dutch people didn't necessarily talk to English people, and German people didn't necessarily. And so there's a wide variety of cultural diversity among the people at Seneca Falls, even though most of them are white. Today, color wipes out the rest of our understanding of the world. There were no known African Americans there. The only known signer of the Declaration of Sentiments who was Black was Frederick Douglass, but I think I will argue that there were probably several other Black people there among the 300 whose names that we don't know, 200 of them. So that we can begin to talk about the way that historic structures in the Seneca Falls area relate to these themes of equity and diversity. One of them is the Wesleyan Chapel, where the meeting was held. It was a biracial church. We forget this. 2 of the trustees were Black men from Maryland who had escaped from slavery, become barbers in Seneca Falls, and trustees of the Wesleyan Church. And they and their families, I think, probably came to hear Frederick Douglass, if for nothing else. They also had Underground Railroad people speak in this church a lot, all kinds of reformers. And then just down the road was the Farmington Quaker Meeting House. Quakers organized this convention. If they hadn't been there, there wouldn't have been a convention. Elizabeth Cady Stanton gets this brilliant idea, but she can't do the work. So it's groups from here who were very active in Native American rights and women's rights and the Underground Railroad for years and years and years, who were also at Seneca Falls. And then if we look at the houses and workplaces that people who attended the convention lived in, you can see there's a wide variety of classes. Some people were so poor they were receiving what we call public assistance. Also included Richard P. Hunt, the richest man in Seneca County. So it's not class that brings people there. At the convention, the 9th resolution advocated women's suffrage. It was introduced by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and there's a backstory behind that if you want to know more, and supported by Frederick Douglass, resolved that it's the duty of the women of this country to secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise. And it would be 69 years, like 3 generations before New York State, allowed women to vote, and 72 years before the US finally passed the 19th Amendment in 1920. In that 72 years, those 3 generations, New York State provided some of the most important, dominant, predominant national leaders for the women's suffrage movement. And you probably know all of these: Frederick Douglass, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Matilda Joslyn Gage. Here are houses that relate to those famous 4. Can you tell me which ones relate to which people? Who's related to house number A? Elizabeth Cady Stanton, yes. How about B? Oh yeah, that's a tough one, you got it. How about C? Yeah, that's a gorgeous house, isn't it? And D, everybody knows Susan B. Anthony's house. All right. Oh, you're good, but that's your first quiz. But there were millions, literally millions of other people involved in the suffrage movement all over New York State and the nation at the grassroots level. And we can look at some statistics just quickly. There were 450 more than political equality clubs in New York State, most of them white. There were more than 100 chapters of local people affiliated with the Empire State Federation of Women's Clubs, which was mostly Black. 1894, just been doing a lot of some work on Isabel Howland as the correspondent. Over 600,000 signatures went to the New York State Constitutional Convention asking for women's suffrage. In that convention, nothing happened. Go ahead. And in 1916, even more than 1 million women signed suffrage petitions. That was the majority of women of voting age in New York State signed suffrage petitions. So, I mean, this movement to me is breathtaking to look just at those raw numbers. Oh, that's all right. I forgot where I am, so.
I'm sorry.
This is a good time for a joke.
Oh, yeah. Okay, Matt, you're up. You got one?
A historian walked into a bar
Okay, there it is. Yeah.
and then they drank a lot.
Oh,
Is that a joke about me?
bummer. I can find where we are if you want. Now, if it'll. Oh, good. If it's, okay. I've forgotten where we are here.
Right there.
Is that where we were? No, it's not. I mean, we were earlier than that. Okay. Excuse us a minute. We'll get it. Okay, there we are. Yeah. 600,000 signatures there. It's not showing though, is it? It's showing not the slide thing, but the, okay, is that good?
Yes.
Okay, phew. Hopefully we got it under control.
No.
No? Well, the question is, we all know the famous historic sites and the famous people. Can we find historic sites that help us tell the story of millions of other people, your neighbors and mine, at a grassroots level? The answer, as you might guess, is yes. And in beginning with the 2017 anniversary of New York State's approval of women's suffrage, and then continuing to the 100th anniversary of 1920 and the 19th Amendment, there were 3 public history projects that tried to answer that question. One of them was the National Votes for Women Trail, which is still ongoing, sponsored by the National Collaborative of Women's History Sites. And there is a database online with a map like this. And the idea is you click on the map wherever you want to find people and they'll come up. There are 2,248 sites currently on that database. And of them, 284, 12.4% of these are in New York State, which has more on this database than any other state in the nation, partly because we've been working so hard to put them on. It's crowdsourced, so if you find something that isn't on there and want to add it from your neighborhood or anywhere else, just put it up. And then based on that model, I worked with Ed Varno and Wilma Townsend at the Ontario County Historical Society in a project funded by Preserve New York on suffrage sites in central New York. And we have about 200 on a database there, along with a huge I can't seem to stop writing when I start writing these things. So it's a long historic context statement, but it does give nice background. You can plug in your own local sites into what's going on there, and it's online if you want to just download it. And then the third one is the William G. Pomeroy Foundation. They're here with the table today, and they started in 2017. They got 33 markers across the state. And now they're working with the National Votes for Women Trail. They're putting up more than 200 of these markers across the country, of which 37 are going to be in New York State. Probably a lot on your territory, you know about these. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Pomeroy. These public history projects have probably more than 3 things, but here are 3. One is they involve lots of people, including many of you in this room. And it's local historians, it's librarians, it's house owners, it's students, it's ordinary people who just get interested in this project. They also really helped me at least see the ways in which suffrage was really a diverse movement, and not over time it changed, over geography, religion, race, ethnicity, class. And finally, they really powerfully reinforced for me the way in which historic sites can tell us in ways that nothing else can, stories about suffrage that make it come real. We found sites that were rural, urban, village sites. It cuts across, one thing nice in New York State is it cuts across political lines because it's red, blue, and purple everywhere, and everybody's interested in it. So you can develop a dialogue with people no matter where they are, and it really cut across classes and ethnicities and races. Now, here are some examples. This was the hard part for me, picking these, because there's less than 10% of the ones I know we found, and we probably only found half or a third of the ones that are out there. So bear with me. If your favorite site isn't here, check it out and add it to the list. And this is kind of organized chronologically from beginnings of the movement to the late 19th century, when women's rights expanded in lots of areas, but not so much in suffrage. And then the development of strong grassroots networks all over this state really surprised me. And then beginning about 1908, an infusion of new energies, new money, younger people. And then finally beyond 1915 to 1920, and then up to where we are today. What do we do with all this? A couple of the beginning sites we marked and found and marked were Susan B. Anthony's childhood home. This is Debbie Craig in Washington County, the home's in Battenville. And also the Johnstown Courthouse, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton found such profound and interesting childhood influences. One of the ones that's usually forgotten is this man. The house is not standing, unfortunately, but Elisha Hurlbut wrote a pamphlet called The Rights of Woman in 1845, in which he carefully went through the laws and showed the ways in which they were not being recognized as human beings and citizens. And he's arguing that rights are human rights. Laws shouldn't be made for man or woman, but for mankind. And that was profoundly influential for Stanton and others at Seneca Falls, who kind of went through and picked it out and added the ideas to the Declaration of Sentiments. 6 women in DePaulville, New York, in St. Lawrence County, bought Judge Hurlbut's ideas and sent a petition in 1846 to the New York State Constitutional Convention and said, we should have equal civil and political rights with men. We're citizens of New York State. It's our right to do this. You can imagine nothing happened. We found lots of sites related to the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention. This is one of my favorites because it's such a beautiful Greek revival building. The Macedon Academy, that Sue Jane and Peter know well, in Macedon, New York. Several people affiliated with Seneca Falls Convention as signers either went there themselves or sent their kids there. Frederick Douglass spoke there. It's just a lovely site. You all should go. One of the most important is this site where the Junius Monthly Meeting of Friends, Quakers, had a meeting house. It's on 9 Foot Road in Waterloo. Meeting house is now gone. It's got a gorgeous cemetery though. And it's so important because at the time of the Seneca Falls Convention, these Quakers at Farmington split apart into the radicals and the quietists, the more conservative ones. And the radicals left and started to hold annual meetings here. And they attracted people like Frederick Douglass, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Charles Lennox Ramon, Sojourner Truth. And they became a model for the later American Equal Rights Association that formed in the 1860s. So they're nationally important. And they invited people, they said Mohammedans, Christians, Jews, pagans, meaning traditional Iroquois, Haudenosaunee religion, and people of all name and no name, all united under the banner of love. Oh my gosh. I became a Quaker after I read that. That was my, I thought, oh my goodness, this was like 1854. We found lots of houses of signers of the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments. I think we found a total of 23 sites. And again, they really illustrate the wide variety of classes of people who came there. And Patricia Corcoran of Mount Hope Cemetery nominated Amy Post's grave. Amy Post was so important because not only did she go to Seneca Falls, she went right home and organized the second Women's Rights Convention in Rochester. And I'm so glad to see that she'll have a marker there in Mount Hope Cemetery. Another one of my favorite buildings is this one because it's still there. It was the site of Frederick Douglass's publication of the North Star. And in 1848, his masthead said, I can't believe this is just, to me, this really speaks to me. Right is of no sex, truth is of no color. God is the father of us all, and all men are brothers. And Harriet Jacobs, whom some of you may know as the author of Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, kept an anti-slavery reading room there as well, and it's still standing in downtown Rochester. He also had a home on Hamilton Street in Rochester. He bought it in 1855, gave it to his daughter Rosetta in mid-70s, but then took it back. And many people think he kept that residence as his residence so he'd have a place he could vote from, because as a Washington, D.C. resident, he wouldn't be able to vote. Religion became an area of debate and battles over women's rights, as it still is today. One of the most interesting sites is this one. It's now a house, but it was then the Congregational Church in the little town of South Butler in the town of Savannah, Wayne County. It was the first known European American congregation to call both an African-American minister and a woman as a minister. Antoinette Brown Blackwell became a long-lived and very active member of the women's suffrage movement. Fanny Barrier Williams in Brockport was born in this house and went to the Congregational Church there, made a national name for herself in Washington, D.C., in Chicago, then came back and retired here and lived here until her death in 1944. This one's not standing, but it's important for the story, so I put in the picture. Steinway Hall in New York City was the site of the 1869 American Equal Rights Association. And this included the same people who were going to those Congregational Friends meetings in Waterloo. And they exploded at that meeting into a powerful, searing debate over the 15th Amendment, which was designed to give Black men the vote, but not Black women, not white women. Frederick Douglass said, when women are hung from lampposts as Blacks have been, then we can talk about making women eligible to vote as well. And he saw it as a way to move toward women's suffrage. He never gave up his commitment to women's right to vote, but he thought politically the strategy should be we should pass the 15th Amendment first, and then we'll work for women's suffrage. Susan B. Anthony was absolutely furious. And if you read the transcripts, which it's well worth doing, you better sit down, it'll knock your socks off. You can't believe what these two friends are saying to each other in public. But it ended up with a split in the movement. So the American Women's Suffrage Association, which was basically out of Boston, supported the 15th Amendment. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton formed the National Women's Suffrage Association, which did not. They finally joined in 1890. A month after that meeting, the Stanton-Anthony New York City, upstate New York group met here in Saratoga Springs at Congress Hall, which is not standing any longer, but it will have a Pomeroy marker, I think. It was they organized the New York State Women's Suffrage Association, which always affiliated with the National Women's Suffrage Association. After the Civil War, we see an explosion of rights for women opportunities, especially if you're white women, partly because the Civil War killed so many men, up to 700,000. What do you do with 700,000 women who might once have married all those men and won't anymore? They have to change their lives to figure out how they're going to survive in this new world. And so the institutions in America have to change to begin to accommodate them too. Never mind what you think about the morality of equal rights for all people. So there was a huge explosion of opportunities for women in many ways, but not so much for suffrage. And one of the key sites that illustrates the stalling of the suffrage movement is this one, the Ontario County Courthouse in Canandaigua. Susan B. Anthony wasn't the only woman in the country to get the idea. The 14th Amendment says any person born or naturalized in the United States is a citizen. So Anthony and Black and white women in Washington, D.C., Cape May, New Jersey, Battle Creek, Michigan, all over the country, there's 4 of them we know of in Seattle, Washington, decided, well, I'm a citizen, citizens vote, I'll go to the polls and vote. 14th Amendment says I can do it. Susan B. Anthony was up for, and so were all the rest of them, up for a rude shock. She was arrested, tried, in June 1873 in this courthouse. The judge, Ward Hunt, who would become on the Supreme Court very shortly, had written his decision before he heard any evidence. And he said, voting is not an issue that's coterminous with citizenship. The states can decide who can vote, who can't, and you can't. And the same decision came down 4 years later in Minor v. Happersett in the Supreme Court decision, and it cut the suffragists off at the knees who were trying to use that approach. But meanwhile, work opportunities begin to expand. Cordelia Greene and Cass Stiles, one of my favorite young doctors, the first woman to graduate from the Women's Medical School in Philadelphia. She kept this water cure like a spa. Dr. Mary Walker from Oswego County graduated 1856. Sarah Logan, the 4th African-American woman to become a doctor, lived in Syracuse, went to Haiti, came back, bought a house in Syracuse. School opportunities began to open for women. This is one that just got a Pomeroy marker, so I featured it here. And besides my cousins, the mayor, she's the one in the yellow thing, Becky Prophet. She's an amazing woman. But Cornell University became a co-educational institution, and you can think of others. Elmira was a women's only, St. Lawrence, Vassar, etc. Religion continued to be an institution that harbored debates about women's roles, but some churches, particularly congregational white ones, were very sympathetic and supportive of women's rights. This church in Tompkins County ordained both Annis Ford Eastman and Juanita Breckenridge Bates as ministers. And Annis Ford Eastman and her husband Samuel then went on to pastor the Park Congregational Church in Elmira. You probably know more about their children than you know about them, because their children were Max and Crystal Eastman, who moved to New York City and became extremely active national leaders in suffrage and other reform movements. Lilydale in Chautauqua County is still a little treasure, and it was very active in women's rights movement and illustrates the close connection between women's suffrage and spiritualism. By the late 19th century, there begins to be suffrage is not going very well. They introduced a federal suffrage amendment in 1878, year after year after year after year after year. It never passed till 1920. So they're really doing everything they can, but nothing's happening. And they begin to form these amazing grassroots networks, and we see examples of them everywhere. Elizabeth Smith Miller, the daughter of Ann and Garrett Smith, and Matt's favorite, was born in Peterborough, but we found, I think, 3 houses, one in Casanova, and then this one in Lockland in Geneva. New York, they made it a center, not just of national, but of international suffrage activism. Everybody went through there and stayed there. They formed the Geneva Political Equality Club, and my blessings on them, she and her daughter Anne, because they kept a wonderful series of scrapbooks with everything they could find about women's suffrage that's still helping us to understand what happened. Elnora Babcock is another unsung heroine. I can't believe this woman, she founded the Dunkirk Political Equality Club. Well, good, everybody was doing that. She became the press secretary for the New York State Women's Rights Association, and she just kept more than 500 newspapers across New York State supplied with positive articles about women's suffrage year after year after year. I mean, you read these reports and they are exhausting just to read what she was doing. And the movement began also to find a home and a base in New York City. This is the Redbury Hotel, which was where the Interurban Women's Suffrage Council met beginning in 1903. In Brooklyn, Sarah Smith Garnett, who was the last wife of Henry Highland Garnett, Catherine, or this morning, and her sister and several other people formed the Equal Suffrage League, which met here in what was then the YMCA. It's now a senior citizens nursing home area, but it's still standing. That's what's so exciting. And women suffragists also began to make strong alliances with working class organizations. There are, I think, 4 women's educational and industrial unions formed in Western New York. There's one in Rochester, one in Buffalo, one in Dunkirk, this one in Auburn, and all of them seem to have suffrage meetings there. This one is now gone. It's right next to the Seward House, but in its place stands the Equal Rights Center. So it's an okay trade-off. We find lots of homes of suffragists, and in Sherwood, New York, it's like Brigadoon. It's an amazing place that you can only see at certain times. But it's so important that for women's rights and abolitionism and the Underground Railroad, that the whole village is on the National Register of Historic Places. And this home of Isabel Howland was recently dedicated for its reopening. If you saw it before this, you would think it will never be saved. And here it is, thanks to local people who did most of this work. Isabel's aunt was Emily Howland, shown here with Susan B. Anthony, who was hailed over and over and over again as a pioneer of the suffrage movement. Incidentally, one of the biggest funders of the suffrage movement, which made her doubly important. She did not die till 1929, the first woman to get an honorary doctorate from the State University of New York. And one reason Isabel is important is she was corresponding secretary at that time of the New York State Women's Suffrage Association. So she and Mary Anthony are the ones who got all of these petitions. And they sit there when they say there's whatever 332,148 names, they've counted every one of them. And they put them in packets by place. And they tie them with a wide yellow ribbon and they send them to the state legislature, and they all burn up, as far as I can tell, in the New York State fire. So they're not there. So frustrating. Jean Brooks Greenleaf was president of the New York State group in that same period. And you would think they'd get exhausted and say, oh, let's take a rest, taking a vacation. Not at all. Jean says, reorganize your forces, call rallies in your county, get local talent, men and women, write letters, take up petitions, just get back to work. In this period, they're also holding annual meetings in local places, most of them upstate New York, across New York State. They hold one in 1901 here in Oswego, in what was then the Presbyterian Church. It's now owned by the American Legion, and it's not in good shape, but it's a gorgeous building. 1906, March 13th, Susan B. Anthony died in her home in Rochester, and her death marked the end of an era, not just for herself and her friends, but for the whole women's suffrage movement. The last speech she gave a month before she died was in the, well, this church wasn't quite built then, it was the previous church, but it was in the AME Zion Church in Rochester. She'd been invited by her friend Hester Jeffrey, this elegant woman you see before you, who was a longtime friend, a suffragist, worked for the National Association of Colored Women, worked for temperance, formed the Susan B. Anthony Club. And after Anthony's death, raised money for the first full-length statue of a Black man in America, which is the Frederick Douglass statue in Rochester today. After Anthony's death, she made sure that Anthony was memorialized in one of the memorial windows for this church that's still standing today. And it was the first public monument to Susan B. Anthony anywhere in the country. 1908, we see an infusion of new energies and new money and new ideas and new tactics that will transform the suffrage movement. And it begins in Seneca Falls with the 60th anniversary of the first Women's Rights Convention, when Harriet Stanton Blatch, who was Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter, she'd been living in England for 20 years. She came back and she said the suffrage movement bores adherents and bores everybody. And we've got to do something to reinvigorate it. So she holds the 60th anniversary meeting in Seneca Falls, Winders Academy, and the Wesleyan, what was then the Opera House, but was before that the Wesleyan Chapel. And they put up this beautiful marker. There's a replica of it today, still on the Wesleyan Chapel. And the New York State Women's Suffrage Association decides they're going to reintroduce a demand for women's suffrage in New York State. Ella Hawley Crossett, who from Warsaw, New York, who was president at the time, said, not since the Constitutional Convention in 1894 had so much work been reported. But Stanton Blatch wasn't done. She went to New York City. She hires Carnegie Hall. She holds a huge rally. And she gets the radical British suffragist Emmeline Pankhurst to come over and stir up the Americans. And she organizes what she calls the Equality League of Self-Supporting Women, because she makes an outreach to working class women, as well as upstate, rural, and village women. And one of the people she recruits is Rose Schneiderman, Polish-born, Jewish, eloquent, extremely good organizer. She helps organize the Women's Trade Union League, and she's credited with developing the phrase, "We want bread and roses too." And she became a very powerful organizer of working class people. African Americans also began to be active, not just among African Americans, but in the larger world for suffrage. The NAACP had its headquarters in New York City. W.E.B. Du Bois, some of you may know, was the editor of The Crisis, their publication. And he has several articles through the 1910s in support of women's suffrage. Wealthy women begin to take up the suffrage cause. Mrs. O.H.P. Belmont says she's going to march in the 1912 parade for suffrage, and her friends are absolutely appalled. And she says, don't worry, I bought a new white walking skirt for the occasion. But even better, she gives lots of money to the National American Women's Suffrage Association and to the New York State group. She hires a whole floor on this building where they can have their offices. She sets up a press bureau, and that kind of money is really going to make it possible to organize it in a much broader way. Upstate New York, Harriet May Mills, who's the president of the New York State Women's Suffrage Association in this period, makes her house on West Genesee Street, which is still standing, a center for organizing upstate. Today, if you go to the New York State Fair, the women's building is called the Harriet May Mills Building. There is a beautiful oil painting of her there that's really just kind of in a corner and ought to be highlighted and brought forth. Young women also became involved in the movement in this period. One of the most famous was Inez Milholland, who was a student at Vassar. She wanted to hold a suffrage meeting on campus, and the president said, no way, this is for moral uplift, not for political purposes. So she went next door to the Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery and held a suffrage meeting. She was the one who rode a white horse at the head of the Washington, D.C. Suffrage parade the night before Wilson was inaugurated. And she, in 1916, was giving a speech in Los Angeles, Supposedly her last words, Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty, when she keeled over and died. And she's buried in Lewis, New York, the Eastern Adirondacks, where her family had a summer home. And they continued these annual meetings across mostly upstate New York, Niagara Falls in 1910, the Shredded Wheat Biscuit Company. They did all these new tactics. They had a suffrage parade in Fifth Avenue that included babies as well as moms. 10,000 people marching down the street. At the head of that parade was Mabel Pinghua Lee, a Chinese-born woman riding a horse. She was never able to vote because she was born in China and could not become a US citizen. But she was a Barnard College student, led the parade, and then worked the rest of her life with the First Chinese Baptist Church in New York City, which is still standing. 1914 is another major turning point for women's suffrage. They held their annual meeting in Rochester. Today, this is the Jiva Theater that lots of you may have gone to, but then was called Convention Hall. They also met in the Powers Hotel, which is still standing. 100 local clubs, 31 county clubs from all over New York State. And it was important because Carrie Chapman Catt, who always had these grand and powerful ideas, said, this is what you have to do to get women's suffrage in New York State. You have to hire organizers, you have to have poll watchers, you have to speak in the streets on stumps, you have to do special editions of newspapers, you have to have automobile parades, you have to have county fair booths, you have to go house to house and get petition signatures. And guess what? They did. They started in Rochester in 1914. She says, I'm training you to be a corner speaker on that corner, and you go out and try it and see how it works. We're starting automobile parades, and we're starting right here in Genesee Valley Park, and they did. And women across the state picked up this kind of idea of what can we do that's creative and different that will get attention. Edna Buckman Kearns, who was then a reporter for the Brooklyn Eagle, went with her daughter, Serena, in this suffrage wagon all across Long Island, stopping to give suffrage speeches in these small towns. So 1915, they're going to have a referendum finally in New York State for women's suffrage. They pull out all the stops they possibly can. 200,000 women working across the state on every street corner. They held over 10,000 meetings. They printed over 7 million leaflets, 150,000 posters. And they had a mass meeting in Carnegie Hall, raised $115,000 in 1915, which was the largest amount of money they'd ever raised in one day. They're keeping their fingers crossed. They have high hopes. Guess what happened? Oh yeah, they hold the suffrage parade as the final thing. The one in 1912 got 10,000 people. This one got 40,000 people. They lost. Over half the voters in New York State said, no, I don't think so. The history of women's suffrage, this one phrase that the disappointment was almost crushing. You can really feel it. Guess what they did? They didn't go home and say, well, we'll try later. 2 days later, they hired Cooper Union. They raised another $100,000. And I love this quote from Juanita Breckenridge Bates from Ithaca. She says, suffrage has fallen, but it's fallen forward. I mean, talk about optimism. And that's when they go door to door, getting more than 1 million signatures from women. And this time they succeed. Women's suffrage finally passed in New York, November 66, 1917. The only person who signed the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments who lived to vote in New York State in 1917 was Rhoda Palmer from Geneva, New York. New York State, with that decision, became the 14th state to approve women's suffrage, the first state east of the Mississippi, and now they began to work at national level for what became the 19th Amendment. And there were two kind of avenues doing that. One was the National American Women's Suffrage Association, who was lobbying the president, lobbying congressmen, working, helping to support the war, saying, aren't we good? You should give us the vote because we're good war workers. And among those were a power couple from Oswego, Ruth Woolsey Mott and her husband Luther Mott, who was then a Republican congressman. And he could support Ruth's local work in Congress, which he did until his death in 1923. Their house is still standing too. On the other wing were a group of radicals led by Alice Paul, who decided enough of this lobbying and diplomacy and trying to be nice. We're going to really make some waves. And they became the first people in American history to picket the White House. And here they are. They got arrested for it, for obstructing traffic, sent to jail, went on hunger strikes, and the story's wonderful that you can go ahead and read. New York had 45 congressional votes. And to make a very long story very short, the country with Tennessee's final vote did pass the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, signed by Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby, August 26, 1920, which is why we celebrate today, August 26, as Women's Equality Day. And it's very simple. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. But the story wasn't over. And neither is this talk, but it's going to be very short at the end. If you can't restrict it because of race, the 15th Amendment, or sex because of the 19th Amendment, if you don't want people like Black people in the South to vote, you have other things you can do as a state. You can pass grandfather clause, you can have literacy tests, you can impose poll taxes if you need to, you can lynch people, and they did. And one of the people in New York State who was most powerful in opposing that, there were many, many people, but Mary B. Talbert, who was associated with the Michigan Street Baptist Church, which is here, worked as the president of the National Association of Colored Women from 1916 to 1920. Then she became a vice president of the NAACP and worked on an enormous anti-lynching campaign. She left very few papers. We don't know where they are, but one of them said, I think it was a newspaper article, I sent out 20,000 letters this year. I'm thinking, oh, she didn't even have email. And it killed her, literally. She died in 1923. Another person who thought this isn't quite over was Alice Paul. She took up the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments and she's reading it and she says, gosh, the only thing we've really done here is get the right to vote for women. What about all these other issues? What about education, jobs, the law, family, legal rights? And so she came to Seneca Falls to the Presbyterian Church in 1923, and she introduced the Equal Rights Amendment. It's been modified a couple of times, but this is what it says now: the equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. It sounds a lot like the 19th Amendment, doesn't it? It still has not passed in the United States. And the struggle for voting rights continued. In 1924, Indian Citizenship Act, no Indians were allowed to be citizens until then, and some don't want to be now. McCarran-Walter Act finally in 1952 said if you're born in Asia, you can be a citizen, but you couldn't before then. 1965 Voting Rights Act seemed to really put federal guarantees behind the rights of every citizen to vote, was gutted in 2013 by Selby v. Holder. In our own time, 2021, 18 states have enacted laws making it harder for people who live there to vote. So what do we do with all this at this time in our own lives and culture? One small thing, relatively, is to look at these historic sites. You can identify more sites. You can add them on the website to the National Votes for Women Trail. You can nominate sites we know or that you know to the Pomeroy Foundation for a historic marker. You can nominate sites to the National Register, and you can publish what you're doing so other people can build on it. There are at least 5 works that relate to suffrage in New York State, either statewide with the Women Will Vote book, which Cornell Press has over on its table, or in local areas. But the larger point is, why do we do all this? What does this mean in terms of the future of our country and our world? And I think if you look back at the suffrage movement, I'm at least so impressed with the way they just kept going. They had a goal that had to do with equality and justice and citizenship, and they just kept going to ensure a democratic country. And I think you as historians do this at a local level. You are part of a vibrant community network. You give so much in terms of persistence and local energy and enthusiasm to what you do, and you share it so generously with all of us. You carry on that legacy, and I want to thank you. And I want to suggest we all keep doing what we're doing, but we think about what kind of larger goals we're working for in terms of the future of the country and the world. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here too. If there are a few questions, I've been reminded I have to repeat them. I'd be happy to take some if you want to talk a bit or not.
Judy, I'm curious, in the course of this research, what were some of the stories that surprised you most? Things that you had not previously been aware of that came to light through this?
Ooh, that's kind of interesting, isn't it? I'll tell you one story, and it's kind of sad to me. Alice Paul was so determined she was going to fight for women's rights. You probably know the story when women from Delta Sigma Theta sorority from Howard University asked to march in the 1913 parade before Wilson was inaugurated. Alice Paul really said, "Nah, I don't think so." One thing that surprised me was they kept at it and they got a lot of support, and they ended up marching in the parade, not at the back as Alice Paul finally agreed they should, but with the other college students. Mary Church Terrell marched with them. I was so happy to see that. But then there was in 1923, Alice Paul decided she's going to take the National Women's Party to this spectacular site where Inez Milholland is buried in Lewis, New York. And her parents were founders of the NAACP. And they had a dean from Howard University and a woman professor staying with them while they're sharing their, they have a big estate, so they give a whole house to Alice Paul and her cohort. And they ask for these Black women from Howard to speak in honor and memory of Inez Milholland and her death. And Alice Paul said, "No, this is for women. This is a National Women's Party thing. We don't want to confuse it with Black people." So they walk up to the grave, it's up on a high hill. Her father's standing there over her grave, and he speaks and he says, "I just had this compelling sense that my daughter's talking to me, and she's saying, 'Dad, why are you so afraid?' So I had to speak out. I want these people from Howard University to speak in my daughter's honor." And finally, after all the ceremonies are over, they do speak at the end. And Lewis, local historians, they're fantastic. Is anybody here from the North Country? I mean, they're just knocking your socks off they had a 2-day celebration in honor of Inez Milholland. And I said, "I gotta go." And so I did walk up to the grave, and I said, I am listening to Inez talking to her dad, talking to me, saying, "You gotta say something here." So I went up and I said, "I'm here, I'm white, but I'm here on behalf of all those Black women and men and other people who've been excluded from this movement, because we can't do this anymore." And right after I went up, a Black woman went up and spoke, and I was so proud of her. And I'm thinking, it's not dead. That's why we're still working on this. So thank you.
Are there any further questions for Judy? No. Thank you all for a wonderful evening. Judy, thank you so much for being with us tonight. We've all learned a lot from you. And Judy, can people get in touch with you if they'd like to learn more? Okay. And we can provide contact information for Judy if you're interested in contributing to any of these projects. I know that she would be happy to hear from all of you and to help you contribute to this. So thank you all. Have a lovely evening. There are still bartenders available. I see them over here. So if you need anything, and we'll see you bright and early tomorrow for the continuation of our session. So thank you.